viruses, prokaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells, we can more, and that should be a little bit of a, some of it is something you've heard before, I'm sure, but it's kind of feel a little bit easier to follow this, I think, because a lot of it is just nutrition, which you have to figure out a little bit about what's needed, but we already covered the 4 main macronutrients. And then environmental factors, so we can cover, like, and we've done that in our last lab, what temperature are they growing in, what are the oxygen requirements, pH, osmotic pressure, and then there's a little bit about associations, ecological associations, so how do microorganisms fit into the whole ecological research, or I guess ecological interaction. So if you have a, how do they interact with each other, with their environment? So biofilms would be an interesting, I think it shows up there, where you have a lot of different organisms living together on surfaces. And then also looking at microbial growth, so it's going to show you how fast microbes grow and how that works. That's really something that we haven't covered yet too much, and it's important. The picture shows you what you're lucky that you don't have to do that. So in certain laboratories, for example, if you can't have any oxygen in it, this environment, this hood maybe is deprived of oxygen, or there could be some condition that the bacteria you're studying or the microorganism you're studying needs, and so you have to somehow find ways. So in this case, that person has these gloves that are always in, and it's never, this chamber is never exposed to the conditions they have in the laboratory. So for example, then you have students that really like high temperature, like you do. So it depends on what you're studying and what needs your organisms have. But we already done a lot of this. So it's a lot. There might be some new components, but really a lot of it is already should sound familiar. You can start making the connection between what we're doing in the lab and the lecture. So just in general, if you look at microorganisms, just like plants and animals, it depends a lot on these factors, like we said, temperature, the pH, nutrients that are available, and gases. And then we always make a distinction between autotrophs, and we'll have to go more into detail about that today. So they're able to capture the energy from the sun, or they use energy from chemical reactions. So in our case, we're not able to capture anything from the sun. So we have to use food to produce energy, and food is really macromolecules that we use for energy production. So in general, for microbes, he was, just as, or similar to us, he would say the nutrition is really the availability or the process in which chemical substances or nutrients, so anything you take in, are acquired from the environment and used in cellular activities. So in your cells, there are probably thousands of different proteins and molecules, and you need to somehow supply your cells with those, and that happens through nutrition. And if you don't, some of them you are able to assemble yourself. Obviously, you're not taking in glucose and then that glucose goes, or any kind of like starch or more complex sugar. You're not you're not eating or ingesting starch and then it goes as this molecule straight into your cell. It's a product of or it goes through the process of being completely or being disassembled, being enzymatically digested to a form where it can actually enter the cell. Because if you remember, if you think about a cell and you have the membranes and you have transport mechanisms, which we're going to look into, it all depends on the size. So if it's a small particle, if it's on a molecular level, it'll be able to go in and out. If you have bigger particles, if you have bigger nutrients, macronutrients, you have to somehow have ways to get those into the cell. And the smaller they are, the easier that's going to be. So essential nutrients must be provided to an organism. So there's essential, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. They're essential nutrients that need to be provided. And the two categories are really the macronutrients. And they're really called macronutrients in this case because they're required in large quantities. So that has nothing to do with the size of them. It's just they're very important, like proteins, and so you need them in large quantities. So that's why they're macronutrients. And then you have micronutrients or trace elements, which means trace elements already tells you need a smaller amount, and a lot of times they're involved in enzyme function or in maintenance of the protein structure. Remember, the proteins have different, we talked about the different structures or levels of folding, and so elements like manganese, zinc, nickel are important to us, but we don't need them in big amounts, so we call those trace elements. And this is an important distinction because once we go into how microorganisms produce and how they feed themselves and how we feed ourselves, it's important to look at the difference between organic nutrients and inorganic nutrients. And usually the nutrient organic is carbon and hydrogen, contains carbon and hydrogen, and are usually products of living things. So remember carbohydrates, C6H12O6 is sugar, so you find carbon and hydrogen in there. Lipids, same thing, glycerol, and the fatty acids was mainly chains of carbon with hydrogen on it. Proteins, you did see some, you have an amino group, so you have a nitrogen in there, but it's most of the rest. You have a carboxyl group, carbon and hydrogen, so that's all there. Nucleic acids, the same thing. And remember the structure of it, there's carbon, hydrogen as the main component. So those four macromolecules that we talked about are really organic nutrients. And then inorganic nutrients contain a combination of atoms other than carbon and hydrogen. So a lot of times for inorganic nutrients, you would look at things like metals in their salts. So there's a couple of examples for salts, but gases are important. So oxygen, carbon dioxide is an inorganic nutrient. It's not produced by a living thing. So a living thing would be maybe, in the a very simple one would be CH4, methane gas, and that's produced by some microorganisms. So that would be an organic nutrient in some case for some species. And then inorganic, if you take for example CO2 in the air, which is really a major component of photosynthesis, which falls under the inorganic nutrients. So you find them in the crust of the earth, for example, in mineral deposits. You find it in water bodies, in the atmosphere. So that's really inorganic nutrients that are supplied by our environment. And these are usually thought of as products of living things containing mainly carbon and hydrogen. So if you're interested in what cells, microorganisms or prokaryotic cells, and maybe eukaryotic cells of microorganisms, what their main nutrients need to be, you look at the cell content and you find out that you have a lot of water, which is always the case, maybe about 2/3 to 3/4 of the of what the cells contain, the cytoplasm, a lot of it is solved in water, so water is always really important. And proteins, and we talked about those a lot, they're always the most prevalent macromolecules because they provide structure, they provide enzymes, which is a really important part. They provide all kinds of structure for the for cellular organelles, and then they also, through enzymes, for example, provide a lot of the metabolic activity. And really, if you think of it as a little machine, what it really needs is nutrients in and to produce energy to keep the cell alive, and that requires energy. So the main 6 elements that are in the in 96% of the cell, if you break it down, would be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen. And all those 6 elements are part of, if you think back to carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins, you find all those in them, or in one of them. They're not part of each of them, but all those 4 macromolecules can be assembled by these 6 elements. I'm not going to go too much into this table because that's really most important to me, that you know the basics, the main elements that are needed. And we should start with the distinction between autotroph and heterotroph. And really, there's 2 things. If you think of organisms, they're categorized, and I'll go a little bit further. If you categorize them by their nutrition, you have to always look at the carbon source. So because it's the main organic compound component, where do they get the carbon from? And a lot of times it's from CO2, and that's when you call them autotroph. And then you also wonder you also distinguish where they get their energy from. So it could be life, which in this case would be a plant. It's a photoautotroph. So it gets the carbon, or let's say if we start with the energy, it gets energy from life, and it uses CO2 to produce glucose or other sugars, but I'll go back to that. So autotroph means the organism uses CO2 as the carbon source, and it is not nutritionally dependent on other living things, because as soon as you go away from if you say need a sugar like we do, then we would already have a compound that's produced by some other organism, and that makes you heterotroph. So you must obtain carbon in an organic form. That's when you're heterotroph. It must be made by other organisms, like plants, for example. Any green, doesn't have to be necessarily green, but any autotroph that produces an organic carbon source can be, well, a lot of them can be consumed, and basically that's how you determine. So just remember, if you look at nutrients, and very important to distinguish between autotroph and heterotroph is, where's your carbon coming from? Is it CO2, the gas that is in the atmosphere? Then you're an autotroph if you can use that as your carbon source. And what it means, carbon source, is really you use that CO2 to produce carbohydrates. I mean, you produce sugars, or you use it to produce lipids. You use it to produce proteins for structure, and you use it to include it in your nucleic acid. So that's really where all the carbon comes from CO2 in the air. And if you can't do that, if your carbon source is something else, you're a heterotroph. So just remember that distinction. Essential organic nutrients, just to add that or include that in this. So growth factors are essential organic nutrients, which means it cannot be synthesized by an organism because it doesn't have the genetic or metabolic mechanism to synthesize them. So a lot of times, if you look at amino acids, for example, remember there is always you call that a growth factor because there's some that you cannot produce and you do need. So there's a whole line of amino acids, and organisms differ in how many they can use and for a protein assemblage. And so if you need something, if you need a nutrient, and it needs to be provided because you cannot build it yourself, it's called a growth factor. Vitamins fall under that category too. So going back to that, so the carbon source, as I said, makes the main difference between autotroph and heterotroph. And then it's really important to know, well, what's the energy source? And for us, the energy source for animal tissues, for a lot of the consumers, we get the energy from chemical compounds. But there is surprising. So we would take. I mean, we could probably write this down and say, if you use the autotroph, maybe example. And I'm not gonna. You can. I mean, it's 6, what is it? These are all the 6. I can equal them out. But what's really important is this is an autotroph. So you would have an autotroph uses CO2. That makes them an autotroph. So it uses this. It uses CO2 out of the air and water, and it produces this compound. So to do that, it needs energy from the sun. That's the energy source, and it does that and produces oxygen, which is important for us to use, and then also glucose. But then if you convert the whole thing, or you reverse it, and I'll write it out, I could just put a reverse sign here. So what we do is we produce CO2, that's what we breathe out, carbon dioxide. Plus energy. Unfortunately, that's way over here, but that's really what we do it for. So it's really, those are the two. If you want to look at it on a very simple level, you have an autotroph who uses the sun energy to make this carbon source, CO2, into something more complex, into an organic compound, and oxygen is a byproduct. And what we do, and it's not because in my understanding, it's because it's part of evolution. So we developed, or a lot of the consumers developed into needing oxygen to actually break this down. So that would be the aerobic metabolism to make carbon dioxide that we breathe off and water, and that's where we get our energy from. So they produce energy, or they use energy from the sun to produce this. And we take that energy out of this chemical compound sugar in the most basic form, we get energy out of it, and we have these byproducts. I mean, we don't really care so much about breathing out CO2 or the water that's left, but we really care about is the energy, and we use this compound that these autotrophs built for us out of CO2. But just remember that so the phototrophs get the energy from photosynthesis, which is taking the energy from the sun, and we get the energy from this organic or from this chemical compound sugar. So just remember that this is really just a reaction that goes both ways. You can just remember one of them, and just imagine, why do we, if you think of like a plant, what's in the atmosphere? It's CO2. We like that they take it off because it's a pretty big, what do they call it? By 11:15, I got nothing left. Greenhouse gas. And so we want, everybody wants to plant trees and more plants because you want them to absorb a lot of that CO2 that comes from burning oil and burning gas and all that. But they pick that up and they make oxygen for us, which we want too, so everybody wants to preserve trees. And then we also can take that matter, that the production or what the plants produce, and use it to produce our energy. And that's why we need, because this is what we need. We need the energy from those from those compounds, from this chemical chemical compound. And so if surprisingly, you could say, okay, so we got the autotrophs, which are always photosynthetic. They use CO2, that means they're autotroph, and they use sunlight, so they're photoautotrophs. Which are these? And they are all the algae. I told you how many algae produce oxygen in the ocean. They're the plants, cyanobacteria. So there's some algae, some microorganisms, some cyanobacteria, some microorganisms in there. They're photoautotrophs. And then you would say, yeah, and then you have the exact opposite. You have the ones that can't use CO2. So that would be us. And we don't know how to use sunlight to make energy. I mean, we do use these because we want to make energy some other way. So you have the chemo, because we don't use photo, we don't use light. We're chemoheterotrophs. So that would be, remember the fungi, they don't photosynthesize, protozoa, animals. So you'd say, perfect, we have everything covered. But there really are some strange, can I wipe that off?
Yes.
There's some strange critters that make it always a little bit more difficult, because I would like to have just the two basics and then be done with it. And so you have some that are actually called chemoautotrophs. So they're able to use the carbon source CO2, but they can't use light. So for example, or they don't use light. So for example, they could be, they call them methanogens or methanogens. Those are the ones that you might hear a lot more about, but they produce methane. And so they use CO2, and I think it should be something like this. Anyways, I can't remember exactly what. I know the carbon source has to be CO2. That's how they are autotroph, but they're not able to use the light for energy. So they use some other compound to get energy from them. So they're like us. They're not really able to use energy from the sun, but on the other hand, they can actually use the carbon from carbon dioxide. And what they produce is methane, and they're really thought to be so common that they might be one of the most common microorganisms there are. And you might hear more and more about them, because what they're responsible is all these methane gas enclosures, and they find more and more. And because of the pressure of, they've been around forever, and so the pressure in the crust and under, basically under the crust in the ocean, the pressure crystallized some of that methane, and so it's basically a natural gas source that they're starting to recover more or discover more and more, because it's so abundant, they think, you know, natural gas may be the solution for hundreds of years for our energy needs, because there are a lot of those organisms. And I would have even known, you know, probably before you came in today, unless you've already taken some other classes, you would have said, I never heard of this, and it could be, or they're thinking of it as a possible solution. So there are these methane-producing organisms that can actually use CO2, but they don't need light for it. And then one other, so on the other side, you also have heterotrophs, so they can't use CO2, but there actually are photoheterotrophs. So that means these organisms, and their examples are purple and green photosynthetic bacteria, but they can use sun for energy. So the energy source is light, but their carbon source is something else, so it's not CO2. So they might need other forms of carbon to produce. And then for our category, the consumers that really don't make anything, we just consume. There's the saprobes and the parasites. So there's just a minor distinction where you look at these areas, fungi, or these groups, fungi and bacteria, and they're decomposing, for example, so they metabolize dead organic matter. We live off of nutrients. They're more metabolizing dead organisms. If you think of fungi and how they grow on old trees, and so old plant matter, or other things, that's where the saprobes come in. And then parasites really use as their source, energy source, they use tissues and whatever the host gives them. So it could be cytoplasm. So parasites are living off of sources that carbon sources that come from a host, but they're still chemoheterotrophs. So just try to read up on this, or not read up, but just try to understand what those different terms mean, because it's important that you have an idea of how do they produce any of their macromolecules. So where's the carbon coming from? So you distinguish between autotroph and heterotroph, and then where's the energy coming from? Can they absorb, or can they use sunlight energy, or do they have do they take the energy from a chemical compound or a chemical molecule, from a molecule? So if you, to go this is pretty much all you need to know about it. The photoautotrophs, there's an oxygenetic photosynthesis, so this is what I just wrote down. You have CO2 and water, and you produce sugars out of it and oxygen. And there's also one anoxygenetic photosynthesis, which it's the same kind of process, but there's not oxygen produced. So there are organisms that do not produce oxygen doing photosynthesis. And in the autotrophs, and I just talked about those, or one of the examples is they survive totally on inorganic substances, so they can use, because they're autotrophs, they can use CO2, but they use energy from other gases, like hydrogen gas, H2, and so they're really independent of. I think down there, yeah, that's the written out formula. So they produce methane by using energy from this compound and converting this CO2 into a methane. But don't worry about the formulas so much. I mean, photosynthesis and aerobic or the metabolism you should know, but in the end, really, it's important just to know where's the carbon coming from, because it's the main element for all the structures you come across. And then if you know that, you can say, okay, so this organism is photosynthesizing and it has chlorophyll, it has chloroplasts in it, or this organism is actually ingesting algae, so it's probably not using energy from that compound, it's using energy from eating other animals or other plants or other microorganisms. So it just gives you a better idea of how all these interactions are.
Or
Yes?
either making it or eating it?
Yeah, I mean, they're not just nice to us. I mean, they're making it for themselves. No plant is making it for us. I mean, they're making it to produce their own structures, but some of their structures, if you think of, fruit or any kind of vegetable, it's usually how they reproduce. You find an apple and you have the seeds in it, and what it tries to do is create this really high energy compound or structure to help the next generation to grow, and we just take it and eat it. Depending on where you go to the bathroom, you might actually help to disperse the seeds. But it's true. Yeah, in the end, really, if you think of producers, that's what the autotrophs are, and they produce pretty much everything. They're the bottom of the food chain, if you want. You have a food chain where you have a first producer, and then you have consumers, and the first consumers are usually plant eaters, and then you have a meat eater and another meat eater, and so there's this food chain, and the bottom is always the producers. They produce, and then the consumers take it up. But then you can also imagine that the consumers at some point die, and they're going to be decomposed and nutrients for the next set of microorganisms, because they're usually the first. So aerobic respiration or aerobic respiration is really the metabolism, or what we do, and that would be going from glucose from a organic compound or carbon source with the help of oxygen. We produce, and that was the second line, we produce energy. And that's so the majority of chemoheterotrophs, meaning we use energy from this compound C6H12O6 or sugar, and heterotrophs, meaning we're not able to use, we're using again that same compound, not CO2, and make energy that way. And we looked at those saprobes and parasites. So if you have saprobes, they're free living. They feed off of whatever that material produces or gives off. But what's interesting is that you sometimes find, that's interesting or important for us, some of those microorganisms could be free living all their lives, or all their 2 seconds of life. No, all their for one life cycle. But sometimes they can actually get into a hospital setting and then become infectious. So they are what they call facultative parasites, meaning they don't have to be, but they can be. Or you could call them opportunistic pathogens. So that's just an interesting side note, that you can have free living organisms that usually feed on organic detritus from plants and whatnot, and then if they get into a host in the right situation, they may actually be able to use the host's nutrients to live. And that's part of what we talked about before. I think it's important to know, because a lot of times, we look at E. coli or other organisms, and it's always questionable why, or it always strikes me as hard to explain why you would have those in your flora, and they would be fine, and then sometimes, or somebody picks them up and they get, for example, from the lower intestines into your stomach or somewhere else, and all of a sudden they're a lot more dangerous. So you just have to keep in mind that for microorganisms, it depends a lot on where they are. It depends on the cell type, depends on the tissue. So it's a lot of that has to do with how how we deal with them or how we respond to them. So they could be very beneficial, and in different areas in our body, for example, they could turn into a disease, and that's always important to remember for them. And then, like I said, once they become these opportunistic pathogens or parasites, they can derive nutrients from hosts. So they therefore, or by doing that, damage tissue, and there's obligate parasites where you really have they're unable to live anywhere else. So they're absolutely specialized in using your nutrients. So kind of like a virus that's absolutely specialized in using your cell for its own multiplication. And this is just, you've seen that probably before, but what's interesting is a lot of times, we talked about that too a little bit, that a lot of those debris, I guess it's what it's called, organic debris, but a lot of that material is hard to get into a cell because you've got a cell wall, for example, or you have, a membrane that isn't able to take in these big particles. And if you're free living, it's a little bit hard to see. Endocytosis is one possibility, but it's not on that same level. So they actually sometimes release enzymes into the environment, and so that those particles are hydrolyzed or broken down outside of the cell, and then they can actually be transported across the membrane and used as nutrients. So it's just one other way that you see in microorganisms like bacteria or fungi, where that's how they get the nutrients in. So since we talked about this so much, what's the question? If an organism is degrading large organic molecules, you're faster than me, I can't even think anymore what I'm reading. Both carbon and energy. So it's degrading large organic molecules. So the energy comes from a molecule and the carbon comes from a molecule, right? So it's heterotroph. It's not photo, it's not using the energy from, and it's a large organic molecule, so it's heterotroph, not autotroph. So chemoheterotroph. I think that question is going to show up in the test. Where are we here? 14. Got to go a little bit further, but we're almost done. It's a short week too, so I don't have to really be too easy on myself. This one is going to be. I'm going to do a demonstration because everybody's probably seen it before, but. Everybody know what diffusion is? I don't have to say a word though. Yeah, you know all of them? Not really that interesting, but I thought I'll do it anyway. Just because it shows you, it always sticks with me that, if you have we just talked about this membrane, and if you take, if you have any kind, or that one organism or fungi and bacteria that are able to enzymatically break down nutrients outside. So a lot of times you would say, okay, so you have a cell membrane, what goes in, what goes out. It costs energy, and so diffusion is just what this is. You would have, if you put this drop in, you can, nobody's going to see because it's on a blue background, but over time, any kind of, or over time particles, how you can imagine this, like, what is this, so the main reason we're going into this is how to, it's still related to nutrients, how do organisms transport across membranes, and the easiest thing is passive transport, which means you don't have there's no energy required. And if you look at this, I just put a drop of that blue stain in there, and there's still a little bit of concentration in some areas, but eventually, without doing anything, it will disperse. And it's because a substance usually, how it says it here, exists in a gradient and moves from area of high concentration to low. So in this case, you have a high concentration of stain, one in that drop, and it starts to disperse. And what it really is those molecules are all they're all moving constantly. And if they're really dense together, highly concentrated, they bump into each other. And the more they spread out, the less they bump into each other. So there's a lot more movement, fast movement in a concentrated state. So eventually, this happens, and this is really, really simple. So it costs zero energy. It just happens because you go from these go from high concentrations, or molecules go from high concentrations to low. So that's diffusion. And this would be another example. I didn't bring my coffee cup with a piece of sugar, but you put the sugar in, and you have this high concentration of, if you would take this corner of the sugar cube, this is highly concentrated, and there's a lot of coffee or mostly water. In a bad coffee, mostly water. Around the sugar cube, so it's starting to do that. It's starting to diffuse, and you could let it sit, and eventually you'll probably have a pretty diluted. You have the sugar completely diluted, and similar concentrations of sugar in the whole cup. But what's important before I let you go is, before we go into active, I'll just finish up with this. So you have two more possibilities. I talked about osmosis before, not knowing how many people know exactly about it, but it really is the diffusion of water over a selectively impermeable membrane. So here usually we talk about sugar, salt, any kind of soluble compound, but there's also the opposite, where water tries to move in and out of places and through membrane. So if you're a fish, for example, and you're in salt water, what do you think happens? What does a fish have to deal with in salt water? Or what does a fish have to do in fresh water, like in a river? What do you think? Like, where's the concentration of proteins, of salts, of everything higher, in the fish or in the river? In the fish. So what happens is the water wants to constantly move into the fish, and that would be osmosis. So the water is water is what moves, and really fish in rivers are basically not drinking a whole lot and getting rid of or peeing a lot more, and if you want to call it that, getting rid of a lot of that, or a lot of the concentrations of whatever they excrete. And then if you go into the ocean, a lot of the fish in the ocean are constantly dealing with losing water, because the concentration of salts is higher outside, so they're constantly trying, with a lot of energy requirements, but they're constantly trying to keep the water in their bodies, so they're drinking a lot more than. So that's how you can maybe imagine, but just remember the difference between diffusion and osmosis. It's really that this is only talking about, osmosis is always about water as the moving molecule, whereas diffusion could be anything. And then facilitated diffusion, just it's the same thing. It's done with the carrier, but we'll get to this next time on Wednesday. That's it. We'll talk about